Hello, welcome to Horse Race Politics. Today is September 3rd, 2020, and in this episode of Horse Race Politics, I will be going into detail about the Massachusetts Senate primary that took place 2 days ago on September 1st. What I'm planning on doing for this channel before I go into the actual primary, basically my plan for this channel, at least for the next couple months, is every day I'm going to make one episode that's around maybe 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, something like that. Every day I'm going to make an episode that talks about something related to the 2020 election, whether it's the presidential election, Senate election, House election, something like that. As the name says, horse race politics, I'll mainly be focusing on like how the candidates are doing in the polls or how they did in some sort of primary and who I think is going to win a certain election. But I might also be going into sometimes their policies that they're proposing and their campaign strategies, all sorts of stuff. But I decided that I would choose today to start my daily series because today is exactly 2 months before the 2020 election. 2020 election's on November 3rd, 2020. Right now it's September 3rd, 2020. So I thought this would be a good starting point for my daily series. Right now I'm actually recording this at night. It's around 9 p.m. right now. But I'm thinking that usually I'll do my episodes earlier in the day. But today I was kind of busy, so I wasn't able to start recording until later in the day. But now that I've gotten that out of the way, I think I can now go into talking about the primary that actually happened 2 days ago. So, 2 days ago, Massachusetts primary happened, Democratic and Republican. Although both parties happened, I would like to mostly focus on the Democratic Party primary because that was the one that was really hyped up. That was the one everyone was talking about. That was actually, in my opinion, one of the most important primary elections of this whole election cycle, the 2020 election cycle. Why this Senate primary election was really important, why it was a really big deal, is because the two big contenders that were taking part in that election. So I think there were more than two candidates, but there were only really two candidates that actually mattered, and those were Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy III. So they were both really big name candidates for different reasons. Ed Markey, it turns out that he's actually been serving in Congress for 44 years. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives for over 30 years, and then he switched to the Senate a few years earlier. So he's been in Washington, D.C. for a really long time. He's a long time congressperson from Massachusetts, so that's why he was really important. And he was running for his re-election. He's the incumbent, and he's been running longer. He's been in office longer than many people have been alive, including his opponent, actually, Joe Kennedy III, which we will be getting into. But it's really funny how Ed Markey has been in Congress since 1976, but Joe Kennedy wasn't even alive until 1980. But yeah, let's get into Joe Kennedy now. So why this guy was really important was, in a nutshell, his last name, Kennedy. It's not a coincidence. His last name is Kennedy. He's a direct descendant of the Kennedy dynasty. He's actually the grandson of Robert Kennedy, the guy who ran for president in 1968 but unfortunately got shot before he ever had the chance to make it to the convention. So he's his grandson, and that means he's the grandnephew, I think that's the proper term, grandnephew of JFK. That was like the biggest reason why he was so popular in the beginning. And that was the biggest reason why he had a serious shot at taking over Ed Markey's Senate seat. But Joe Kennedy, he started out. It turns out that whenever he first entered the race for the Senate seat last year, I think it was last summer around there, he was actually doing really well in the polls. He was beating Ed Markey by over 10 points at that time when he first entered. That's because at the time, no one really knew who Ed Markey was. Although he was in Congress for a long time, he didn't really have that big of a deal. Like, he was just that one senator that was there. But Joe Kennedy, he had his last name. That was really all that he needed to immediately propel to the top of the polls. That this was in Massachusetts, keep in mind. In Massachusetts, the Kennedy name, the Kennedy dynasty, is highly respected. And until 2 days ago, it turns out, I was kind of surprised by this, no Kennedy has ever lost the race in Massachusetts. JFK hadn't, none of his relatives have either. But yeah, I was really surprised by that. I thought that was a pretty interesting fact. But turns out he was the first Kennedy to lose a race in Massachusetts. And it turns out that Ed Markey will be facing the Republican candidate in November, which turns out to be Kevin O'Connor. I'll go into the Republican primary briefly because why not? Since it happened, I might as well talk about it. So there were two candidates in that, Kevin O'Connor and Shiva Ayyadurai. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There were two candidates. That Republican primary is not going to really matter much. I'm like 99.9% sure that Ed Markey is going to beat Kevin O'Connor, who won the primary yesterday, 2 days ago, sorry. So it was Kevin O'Connor versus Shiva Ayyadurai, and Kevin O'Connor got around 60%, while Shiva got around 40%. So Kevin had a pretty big lead there, but that's not going to mean anything. Most likely, it's really unlikely that he wins the Senate race. But going back to Ed Markey versus Joe Kennedy, Ed Markey won 55% of the vote to Joe Kennedy's 44%. So that was also a pretty decent margin, 11 points. And yeah, it actually turns out they were the only two candidates running. I wasn't sure if there were more candidates, but I guess no one else bothered to run when these two big names were already running. So Ed Markey won by 11 whole points, which is actually a pretty big turnaround from where Markey and Kennedy originally were in the polls around a year ago, a bit over a year ago actually at this point. And the story of how this whole primary played out is actually like a really interesting for a Senate primary. It's like actually gotten so much attention, and it's actually been a really big deal. So originally Joe Kennedy was doing really well in the polls because of his last name, and because no one really knew that well who Ed Markey was, even though he had been serving in Congress for 44 years in Massachusetts. People didn't really know who he was, even in Massachusetts. But everybody knew who Joe Kennedy was, obviously. His last name, his political bloodline, how his grandfather was in the Senate, ran for president, how JFK was also president. All that was enough to get him to the top of the polls a year ago. But it's actually kind of interesting how Ed Markey went from this senator that no one knew about, how he was able to develop his own identity as this progressive senator that was fighting for the Green New Deal. Because even though he's been in the Senate for a really long time, he's had sort of a centrist voting record for the most part. If you look at his voting record, it's been more of a centrist, center left voting record. It wasn't really that progressive. But what what progressives were able to do is they were able to take his newer political accomplishments, like him working with AOC on the Green New Deal. They were able to take that and they were able to rally behind that and campaign hard for that under Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. Because it turns out that AOC probably helped him quite a bit to win this primary. So the biggest endorsement from Ed Markey was probably AOC, and then also Elizabeth Warren. Those are the big endorsements. For Joe Kennedy, the big endorsement was Nancy Pelosi. So it was kind of interesting to see how this entire primary played out over the course of a year. I read an article not too long ago. It was talking about how Joe Kennedy's one of his main plans was to do well by campaigning well on the campaign trail, but because of the pandemic, that kind of didn't happen. He was not able to do the campaigning that he was planning on doing because of the pandemic. So I think that actually hurt Joe Kennedy quite a bit, and that actually helped Ed Markey quite a bit in the primary. It was interesting to see how in this primary election, the progressives rallied around the older incumbent instead of the younger primary challenger. In most Democratic primaries that I've looked at the results for, usually the progressives have rallied around the younger challenger instead of the older incumbent that has been in Congress for like a decade or two. In this specific primary election, Ed Markey had been in Congress for over 4 decades. That's longer. He's been in Congress for longer than many of his voters were even alive for. He's been in Congress since 1976. That's a really long time ago. He's been in Congress for a really long time. So it was interesting to see the progressives rally around Ed Markey instead of Joe Kennedy, who was much younger and had been much in Congress for many years fewer than Ed Markey. Joe Kennedy, I forgot to mention this earlier. He was currently serving in the House of Representatives for one of Massachusetts district, fourth district. Yeah, he's currently congressman from Massachusetts fourth district, but because he lost the Senate election, he's not going to be in any chamber of the Congress starting in 2021. So it was pretty interesting. Joe Kennedy was the much younger candidate, much newer, fresh on the block candidate, but the progressives decided to rally around the much older one, the much more experienced one. I just thought that was a pretty interesting change from the norm. So this means that Ed Markey is almost certainly getting another 6 years in the Senate, and that would bring his total time serving in Congress to an entire 50 years, 5 decades, half a century. I honestly think that's really insane how long that is. That is way longer than I've been alive, that's for sure. Like, by the time I was alive, he'd already been serving in Congress for a couple decades. And even after I'm alive, he's going to be serving for a couple more, which I think is really insane. As for Joe Kennedy now, he's been serving in Congress since 2013, so when he retires in 2021, that'll be 8 years in the Congress. What he does after he retires, I'm actually not sure of at this moment. I think what his plan was that he would win the Senate election and then maybe in 2024, 2028, run for president from there, from his Senate seat. Kind of like what JFK did back in the 50s and 60s. But now that he didn't win the Senate seat, now he doesn't have any position in Congress. So it's going to be interesting to see what he does from here. But I don't think his political career is over. Definitely not, because he's still pretty young and he's already served in Congress for several years. I feel like he might try to win the Senate seat again in 2024. Maybe if Elizabeth Warren retires in 2024, then Joe Kennedy might try to run for that. Or maybe on the off chance that Joe Biden chooses Elizabeth Warren for a cabinet position if he wins the election, maybe then Joe Kennedy can fill that Senate seat if he gets appointed by the Republican governor, Charlie Baker. But yeah, Republican governor. I don't know if Joe Kennedy will get appointed because the governor's Republican, but the governor might also be forced to appoint a Democratic person for the Senate seat because the legislature in Massachusetts is hugely dominated by Democrats, so he might not be able to choose a Republican for that Senate seat. I should probably bring up now that even though Joe Kennedy is out of the running for any congressional seats, that doesn't mean that a Kennedy won't be serving next year in 2021. Although Joe Kennedy is out of the running for any congressional seat, there's still another Kennedy that's currently still running for a seat in the House of Representatives, and that Kennedy is Amy Kennedy. She is the wife of Patrick Kennedy, who's a former House of Representatives member, and Patrick Kennedy was a son of Ted Kennedy, the longtime senator from Massachusetts and brother of JFK. Now, the thing about Amy Kennedy is that she's not really like related to the Kennedys by blood. She married Patrick Kennedy, so I don't know if you would technically count that as like an actual Kennedy, but like the last name is obviously still there. So if you count that, then a Kennedy could still potentially be serving in Congress in 2021. I believe she's running for a congressional seat in New Jersey. I'm not sure the exact district number, but I believe it's a seat in New Jersey. I'll have to check up on the exact number. But her husband held a seat in Congress in Rhode Island actually from 1999 to 2011. Apparently, he dropped his Senate seat. He didn't bother to run for re-election in 2010 because after his dad Ted Kennedy died in 2009, he sort of felt like his life was taking a different turn and didn't feel like he needed to serve in the House of Representatives anymore. So I think it'll be pretty interesting to see how that uh, primary race, how that election turns out, the New Jersey House of Representatives elections. It'll be interesting to see if Amy Kennedy can win that congressional seat and see if a Kennedy will still be serving in Congress in 2021 onwards. I think that is it for this video now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Horse Race Politics. I'm hoping that I'll be able to do one episode a day, every day, at least for the next few months until the elections end. After the elections end, I'm not exactly sure which direction this channel will take, but I want to see how this channel can do until then. See how well I can keep up with a daily schedule on this channel. Well, I hope that all 7 of my subscribers enjoyed this episode of Horse Race Politics. Right now, I really have a low number of subscribers, but I'm hoping that over the next few months, as the election day nears, I can hopefully grow this channel more and more, and maybe get substantially more subscribers by election day or election month, I guess, even. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hopefully see you guys tomorrow in another episode. I'm hoping I can keep up this daily schedule. Let's see how it goes.